Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, allow me to welcome you to the KPPC, the Kuwait Public Policy Center, to our flagship program, the lecture series. Tonight, we have a very special guest, and we have a very interesting, thought-provoking theme that we'll talk about. And the title itself is "The Future is Biological, Not Digital, from IR 4.0 to IR 1.0. About our speaker tonight, Chandran Nair, a futurist, an innovator, a thought provoker. Chandran Nair is the founder and the CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT, an independent Pan-Asian think tank. He is the author of The Sustainable State, Consumernautics, and the creator of The Other 100. Chandran was the Asian Pacific Chairman of Environmental Resources Management until 2004, the world's largest environmental consultancy. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Club of Rome, part of the WEF Global Agenda Council, Senior Fellow of SIM Asian Research Institute, and an advisor to Cambodia's royal government. Chandran has served as an adjunct professor at H. Cust and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He formerly advised Oryx Corporation and was a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Council for BASF. So about the lecture tonight, he's going to talk about business, technology leaders, and policymakers have been making a buzz about the fourth industrial revolution, IR4, characterized by big data, artificial intelligence, and automation. But despite the hype, digital technology was unable to control nor prevent the spread of the coronavirus, the single biggest challenge to humanity in a century. Instead, it was sound policy interventions, accessible healthcare, devoted healthcare professionals, and good common sense, rooted in collective welfare, that flattened the curve and saved lives. The device most critical in controlling the outbreak was not a fancy contract tracing app. Industrial Revolution 4.0 policymakers should ensure that the building resilience and sustained prosperity for all, a concept he calls Ensured Resilience 1.0. Founded by safety and security against shocks, this is more than a mere stockpile of goods or reserve of funds. It is an economic restructuring that meets everyone's basic needs, preserves natural systems, and establishes social safety nets. At its core, it is a fundamental understanding that the human beings are a biological species and live on a biological platform and not a digital one. The future is biological, not digital, best believe. The baton is yours, Chandran.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. No, good evening, I suppose, everyone. It's Wednesday morning here in Kuala Lumpur. And assalamu alaikum. And I'm very pleased to be with you. And I'm privileged to have this opportunity to address all of you for about maybe 30, 40 minutes. And then we can have a discussion. So I'm based typically out of Hong Kong. And at the moment in Kuala Lumpur, which is where I was born. And I will share with you some thoughts. As far as mentioned, my intention is to be intellectually honest, not intentionally provocative, in the hope that we can stimulate a discussion about policy making. Much of my comments will be rooted in my experience of working around the world, from Africa right through to Asia, and of course in parts of the Middle East too. And I hope some of this will be, of course, relevant to you, and you'll find it interesting. So I'm going to talk about why the future is biological and not digital. And we overstate the IR 4.0, the Industrial Revolution 4.0, and we need to get back to basics. So let me start by sharing you a deck of slides. I've got quite a lot of material here, so I will go through it rather quickly. But the hope is also that all of you can have access to the slides. There's no intellectual property protection here, and please disseminate as freely as you can. But because there's a lot of material, I might rush through some of the slides without going through every bit of detail. So let me start by basically, firstly, thanking the Kuwait Policy Center for this opportunity, Public Policy Center for this opportunity. I'm a big believer in public policy. And I think in many countries, including my own, it's underrated. And we have not developed policy making as an important discipline within our governments. And I'm a big believer that the state must set policies in the coming 21st century, which for all the reasons I've described, is going to be perhaps, in my view, perhaps the most unique in human history. and we will have to navigate through policy, and the state becomes fundamentally important. So I'm delighted to be here. So I start by saying that we are at the moment in the midst of a pandemic, the first pandemic in 100 years, and we need a major rethink. It's an ideal opportunity for us to debunk so much of the mythologies and ideologies that have been foisted on us, which we've essentially been seduced by. The world is clearly in uncharted waters. Many of the lessons, models, and ideologies that business and governments once held, they are going to have to change. We currently talk about threats, but this new world also presents an opportunity for leaders to create something better if they reset and they rethink. In my view, this requires a complete rethink about what leadership means in all its permutations, and therefore what leaders decide will be the policies for the future. And that's the major overhaul I'm talking about. And I call this the time, the moment, the pandemic is a moment for all narratives to be discarded, dismantled, and debunked. And I think this is the ideal moment for us to capture a new imagination, an imagination that I called the future is biological and not digital. And in the next 30 minutes, I hope to explain the logic, the simple science-based logic of what the planet looks like and what we human beings need. We will not be able to use an app to navigate the 21st century. We will have to essentially resort to fundamentally understanding the biological nature of our existence. So the world we live in, population peaking at perhaps 10 billion in the next 30 years and very unevenly distributed. In the Asia Pacific where I live, it'll be the most crowded part of the world with about 6 billion people. And in the part of the world you live in with Africa, etc., included in that, that too will be a heavily populated part of the world. Exponential growth in human population is what we are experiencing. And this generation is experiencing, the last 30, 40 years has been the path of exponential growth in human population. I'll give you some numbers later for us to really understand what that means. And many of the ideas from the 80s are no longer viable. Things like everyone should own a car, that growth is perpetual, and exponential growth is the only way for us to create shared prosperity. In my view, these are all very old-fashioned ideas. And unfortunately, even within the pandemic, there is two sort of almost dysfunctional narratives going on. One about everything must change and everyone wants to go back to how it used to be. But the enabler to go back to how it used to be needs to be the most creative thing we've ever developed, which is technology. And that seems to be a very shallow discussion of what we need to do if we are to reimagine the world and our societies. So now more than ever, we need clear leaders armed with new ideas and the courage to act on them. What I try and do is provoke that intellectual honesty and that rigor as we look at where we are today in the world. And here's a bit of a glimpse of the way I look at the world. That's a circle around Asia, and you will know where you all, the part of the world you all live into. But I've shown in on that purely for the fact that more people live inside that circle than outside it. So just look at the world. That's where most of the people live. And that part of the world and the actions we take, the way we govern, the policies we make will essentially define the course of the 21st century. It's not what happens in the UK, Germany, or the United States, or Canada, or Australia. It really doesn't matter. What happens in this part of the world will matter because not because we are special people, but because of the numbers. So when you zoom in, 60% of humanity, majority live in this part of the world, and majority are not mobile in global labor markets. Exceptional diversity of people, cultures, and nature. The oldest rainforest, the most diverse tropical biodiverse, the most diverse biodiversity in the world in the tropical world is found in this part of the world. 1 in 5, however, have no access to basic sanitation. 1 in 4 urban populations live in slums. I have been to many parts of the region where people have mobile phones and they don't have toilets, they don't have proper education, etc. The mobile phone has become ubiquitous and everyone's talking about fiber optics, but people don't have the basics. And these inequalities, or so I say this divide in terms of what are the needs that people have will only get exaggerated if we continue down the rabbit hole of believing that somehow if you give everyone connectivity, everything is going to be okay. And I think even Bill Gates said that connectivity is overrated, hugely overrated. Uneven development leading to erosion of traditional social nets and unrest, even in many parts of the world. And the world's most polluted and degraded continent is the Asia Pacific region. 9 out of 10 people breathe air below WHO standards. And that's not just an Asian problem, now it's a global problem. So how the 21st century has already surprised us, or we have lived through the first 20 years, it surprised us in terms of the conflicts continue. 9/11, invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, destabilization in the Middle East and North Africa, the global financial crisis, the next one's coming, slow recovery in the West, backlash to globalization, Brexit, Donald Trump, or all backlashes towards globalization. A globalization which essentially was not what the West expected. A globalization in which the rest would rise, essentially through a spanner in the works of the globalization model that was essentially one that the West wanted to manage and control. So Brexit was the British saying, I've had enough of this. Donald Trump was a reaction to essentially white America saying, we need to be number one. But that's not how the world's going to look like. And then there's the rise of the rest, China, India, Nigeria. The almost daily assault on China, which we see very closely, is shocking. And it's the inability of the Western world to cope with the rise of another non-Caucasian race. These are all issues that we will have to deal with. And who knows what will happen when India and China, India and Nigeria, and even Egypt become more powerful and stable economies. The two hottest decades on record in the last 20 years, the melting of the Arctic, all of these are scientific data, it's not opinions of mine. And of course, we thought that the spread of the internet would be a universal good. It's proven to be actually far from it. And that too has been a reversal that now even governments all around the world are beginning to come to terms with. So despite the evidence, we continue to be in denial. And but the pandemic is an opportunity to rethink. Only if we are prepared to be actually absolutely honest about what is the trajectory of human existence, and particularly given the existential threats we face in the 21st century, which I will mention later on. But perhaps the thing to remember is that this is the largest disruption to global society and capitalism since the Second World War, perhaps even going back 30, 40 years before the Second World War. The economic impacts are massive. You will all know that, and I won't go into every one of the details. But just to say that there have been economic impacts, some of which will take countries 20 to 30 years to recover from. I live in a country which is middle income. I'm based in Hong Kong, close to China, but I'm also a citizen of Malaysia. And I think the shock to the system will take us 20 years to recover from. There's cultural and social consequences as well. All of this talk about mass work from home amongst professionals and white collar workers is essentially a bit of a charade. Most people don't work from home. The rice we eat, the food we consume are not grown by people working from home. So the conversation in these echo chambers of people in mass media, in tech circles, that the future is work from home is essentially a massive lie. Most people can't work from home. And human beings are not meant to be cooped up in homes, even if you're middle class and wealthy and working from home. It's a very unhealthy existence. But the reality is most people can't work from home. And then there's pressure on essential workers, migrant workers stuck or forced to go home. And of course, we've also seen disruption to important government businesses, etc. But then at the same time, a new reliance on the internet and technology, which in my view is an extremely dangerous trend. And then we've seen racism towards Chinese communities all around the world, and particularly in the United States, where one would think after the Black Lives Matter movement going back a year ago, which was the anniversary yesterday, America couldn't get more racist, but it seems there's a lot more racism to be found in America against people of all descriptions who are not part of what is considered the white majority. And at a geopolitical level, we're seeing closing of borders, rapid rise in anti-China sentiment, and the geopolitical tensions we feel hugely and clearly. You all living in the Middle East know exactly what that is, because You've had decades of the geopolitical tensions. But the pandemic has also brought that much to the forefront. So now everything must change. But can we? Are we able to do that? And in my view, this requires policy making of a very new and different kind. So policy making in the 21st century requires a broad understanding of global affairs and demands being aware. I'll just give you an example, my friends. The Singapore government, I've been saying for a long time, since the pandemic essentially exposed the fragility of global supply chains, that one of the key priorities for any country with the world will be food self-sufficiency. Well, Singapore only about 2 months ago announced that where they had a development model for about 40 years, where it was a deep sort of commitment to globalization, that you created economic wealth, and economic wealth therefore allowed you to buy food and resources from other parts of the world at prices that were essentially won within the global supply chain, and you have to worry about all the externalities. Well, Singapore is just committed to trying to grow 30% of its food. This is a massive change for a small place like Singapore. So it's really thinking about the world we're living, not living in some dystopian, utopia, and fantasy world, and thinking about the realities. And the pandemic is a time for us to think about it. How did we get here and what must change? I will try and talk a bit about that. But policymakers need to understand this. But what is the root cause of our collective denial in terms of governance systems, economics, growth and development models, our business models, which I can talk a lot to you about, the fact that most of our business models in the world today are essentially at war with the planet and people. And until we begin to understand how our business models need to internalize the externalities of the entire supply chain and disposal, we will continue to essentially erode the fragility and the resource base of the planet and the biosphere. We need to understand limits. How do we lead by reimagining the future rather than sticking with business as usual? And beyond functional skills in terms of business leadership or policy or political leadership, the usual playbook about leadership, policy making skills are critical. We need to teach this to people, even if they're not going to be policy makers. But what is policy making? What is the buy-in? What is the social contract that is essential to make policies work? And very importantly, I think, is intellectual honesty. We live in an era of great intellectual dishonesty, and some of the most powerful people in the world engage in this. Politicians, business leaders, even academics have now indulged in intellectual dishonesty because of the tyranny of essentially the mentality that there is a popular narrative that we have to follow. As you can see, my narrative is very not the mainstream. I hope it will become more popular. So an overhaul in how to understand the 21st century is what I'm trying to talk about. So let me just shift gears and then give us a bit of a perspective of how we got here. The world in the 18th and 19th century was the Industrial Revolution, new manufacturing, the development of mechanized transport, but it was characterized by environmental degradation, extinction, population increase. You can go back and look at the rates of extinction, etc. And we are living through the fastest rate of extinction of flora and fauna in the world. In the last 40 years, we have lost something like 60% of global fauna animals. And with the Industrial Revolution has been dawn of the Anthropocene. For those who you might not be aware of, I'm happy to send some links, etc. But it is essentially the dawn of what is the human era, the ability of human beings to essentially change the planet. And typically the planet's age and the changes were defined through geological eras. And we have now arrived at the dawn of the humans, and the ability of the humans to essentially change the planet, and it's called the Anthropocene. Then we have the world in the 1990s, about 200 years ago, the colonial period, the using cheap and abundant resources from European colonies in Africa, Asia to create wealth, mainly in Europe. That led to wars, World War I and World War II. The global financial system was created after World War II. And then we had uprisings and decolonization in the 50s. Most parts of Asia were decolonized, as was Africa and large areas of the Middle East. We saw the end of apartheid only in Africa in the 1990. Move forward, then we had the start of the 21st century, the end of the Cold War in 1991, the view that the end to the division of power by political ideologies, Western liberal ideologies had won, everything else didn't matter. The dominance of the US and the rise of democratic societies, the rise of China then began to challenge Western political ideology, and it has apex now. The Middle East in turmoil after the illegal invasion of Iraq and the arrival of computers, internet, and smartphones. That was essentially 20 years ago, the world in the noughties, as they say. And there was a lot of hope. There's a lot of belief in technology that it will solve all our problems. And that fundamentalism in the belief in technology as a panacea for all of ills has continued. My view is this is the time to take a rain check and think differently, because the evidence should be very clear to anyone who's not in denial. Today in 2020, what do we have? A population of about 7.8 billion people, exponential rise in carbon emissions. We all know that climate change is real. Newly rich countries, increasing pressures are on them. US-China tensions, global pandemic, crippling economies and healthcare systems, a shock to the system, unanticipated. No one thought this would happen. And the most advanced economies in the world, in Europe and the United States, essentially finding it most difficult to cope with this threat. The question is why? That is more of a discussion about notions about freedom, collective welfare, and individualism. And we have the hottest decades since records were kept. So that's where we are today. So I just like to just mention that, you know, when we talk about globalization as well, which is essentially the world we live in, the key features of today's globalization are unparalleled speed of trade. We all know that the death of distance, the instant information, much of it rubbish, as you all know, the globalization of finance, and with it, the huge risk into the global systems, the view that technology is a panacea for all our ills, pushed by tech companies, markets, etc. But then we've also seen the mass migration of people around the world, some of it good, but some of it resulting in great suffering around the world. But at the same time, what I call the assault of modernity, the assault of essentially an idea that modernity is the acceptance of westernization, has created lots of confusion in the world about the re-examination of identity. The entitlement to instant gratification is also something that is part and parcel of our business, part and parcel of our business models and our understanding of how consumption works and our rights and freedoms. Then there's urbanization, the displacement of labor by technology, which is conveniently ignored and complex arguments developed to suggest that it'll all be okay. Well, it's not going to be okay, as we can already see. And then there is the issue of the erosion of social nets, the loss of innocence, which is a big issue in my mind, particularly with technology, and cultural erosion. So what are the drivers and what are the consequences of all of that? The consequences are that the critical challenges of the globalized 21st century need a concerted effort. And my view is they require us not going down the rabbit hole of what is the latest fad. The latest fad at the moment is let's go digital. And I want to argue that I'm not against digital technology. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm not against technology. But this obsession, this super hyped obsession that everything can be digitized will take us down a rabbit hole. And I don't think will address the challenges of our times. They ignore the realities. So the challenges of the globalized 21st century, the critical challenges are, firstly, the shift of power and influence from the West to the East, challenging out-of-date global rules, as well as ideas. There's still a fascination in the non-Western world to think that if someone from Harvard says the world is flat, it must be flat, and let's go and check it out. And if they say we're going to have driverless cars, well, that must be a good thing. And all of that sort of hubristic sort of obsession with ideas that essentially further this notion that if advancement is essentially only in the form of technology. Innovation is technological, rather than innovation essentially even being new social constructs, new political ideologies, new belief systems, and how do we live in a constrained 21st century. So the assault of the biosphere, mass extinction of flora and fauna, and no effective solutions for ensuring the wealth of the commons, none at all. Fisheries, forests, climate change, we have no solutions. And the preservation of cultures and traditions become huge as the assault of what I call modernization essentially continues unchecked, unabated. So can we have unchecked globalization? In my view, no. But is globalization a good thing? Yes, but depends what you want. And that is essentially shaped through policy making. So today's most critical governance challenges, very quickly, humanity's growing ecological footprint, the rules of international trade, intellectual property subsidies, the scramble for resource rights, and the list goes on. I would just want to emphasize that we need to correct inequality issues, and distribution and accumulation of wealth needs to be done in ways that do not further economic inequality, both at the local level and at the global level. And fundamentally, we're going to have to manage global pandemics because there are others coming. As human beings, essentially do not respect any limits and believe foolishly that somehow we can innovate ourselves out of the messes that we have created with technology. So will this persist in 2050? I suggest they will, unless we change our way of thinking. So this is a much I do a talk just about why the 21st century will be different, which is a 2-hour session. I'm going to race through it in about 2-3 minutes. My belief, I will argue that the 21st century will be very different for 5 reasons. First, for the first time in human history, the global population will peak and decline. This has never happened in human population. And I explained earlier that we are living through the period of exponential growth. The world's population has essentially quadrupled in the space of about 100 years, 10,000 years of human civilization. And in the space of 100 years, the world's population has quadrupled. The world's population about 100 years ago was just 2 billion. Second, for the first time, climate is essentially out of control. Everything we know about where we live, what we eat, how we grow our food, the animals we coexist with, the seasonal changes, everything is about to change. This has not changed for hundreds of thousands of years. This is about to change in our lifetime. It's already begun. So we're going to really need to understand what this means. Everything's up for change. And we are not going to just do this by pretending that we can invest in less fossil fuels, etc. Of course, that's going to need to happen, but it will require fundamental reconstruct of our economies, and particularly for the more populated parts of the world, where the populations are going to increase, like Asia, Africa, the Middle East, etc. We're going to really have to understand that trickle-down economic theories will not work, that we cannot consume anything we want. There will be a price for consumption, and we will have to price them. And in my second book, The Sustainable State, I talk about how policymaking needs to essentially address this issue of basic rights. Most people in the world do not have access to the basic rights. And the basic rights of food, shelter, safe water supply, education, healthcare, etc., are fundamental human rights. To just address those, and housing too, will essentially need so much inputs that they will have an impact on the climate. The climate is not going back to where we think we want it to be, but we will have to live with it. But most importantly, we will have to address the needs of the underprivileged, and they are the majority. The other point I want to make is that makes the 21st century very different will be this whole technology overreach. We have too much technology for our own good. And again, I say I'm an engineer, so I cannot be against technology. But the inability to understand how do we need to restrain some of this. And I have many examples, but I don't have time to go into it. But technology is important, but its overreach at the moment is, in my view, one of the biggest challenges that we as people in policy making will need to understand and come to terms to, rather than being seduced by the notion that if you speak against overreach of technology, you must be a laggard and a Luddite, and you don't understand. And finally, there's what I call the crisis of capitalism. The crisis of capitalism is not about financial markets or essentially fiscal restraint and all of those things. Fundamentally, the crisis of capitalism, which is how can we live on a planet in which you are urged to consume more and pay less? The whole mantra of buy one and get one free. This cannot work. This is against the laws of physics, entropy, etc. So we have a completely dysfunctional way of understanding how do we provide for needs of people, and because that's why we provide goods and services. But we now have a system in which we are relentlessly urging people to overconsume by underpricing both the raw inputs and the cost of disposal. And the whole carbon issue is just tip of the iceberg. My first book, called Consumptionomics, essentially talks about this fundamental crisis. 6 billion Asians in 2050 aspiring to live like the average American or European is a very, very bad idea. We cannot go there. It will destroy the planet. And it's not me making up a story. These are just scientific facts. And so we have to rethink, what do we mean by capitalism? What is it for? What needs are we trying to serve? And finally, the fifth part of why the 21st century will be different is 10 billion people, there is not enough to go around, resource constraints. I can go from fisheries to forests, to anything you want to talk about, but there are resource constraints. And resource constraints are not going to be helped by simply following our current model of consumption and believing that some app will essentially conserve resources. So that's a 2-hour session, but I've just gone through it very quickly. But the resource constraints issue, just to give you a glimpse of what it looks like, 1 in 9 people globally do not get enough to eat. That number is possibly going to increase. The world lost 25 million hectares of forest last year, the same area as the United Kingdom, through a completely inefficient method of essentially converting land and forest for food production and agriculture on an industrial scale. So the competition for key resources, the cause also of domestic and geopolitical tension, we will have to really rethink. But the key issue is, how will the large countries of the world deal with this? And it's fundamentally policy. So I often say the big countries, if you compare China and India, I would argue Chinese policy making is far ahead of the Indian policy making. And it's essentially a political, it's difference in the political systems. The ability, as you all know, as policy makers, to think of policy and then to enforce it. Those are two very different things. And in large countries, we're going to need tough policies. I call them draconian policies, not to scare people, and then the ability to implement them. Because in the United States and Europe, I argue, for instance, that car ownership is not a human right. Try saying that in the United States. When I say in the United States, I think they think I'm some kind of Taliban fundamentalist or something like that. So why is the future biological and not digital? Human beings and human well-being is premised on the viability of natural systems. Please let us get this right. We all know this, but we have all been so in the last 40, 50 years hyped up by this idea that somehow we can live some virtual lives. Well, the pandemic has taught us that essentially human beings are biological. Human beings are biological entities, and their viability and their lives depend on the viability of natural systems. Humans occupy the biosphere. That is the platform. Humans do not occupy a digital platform. A digital platform will not save them. Human beings are ravaging the biological platform, and it is even tech-enabled. When I mean by tech-enabled, I can give you examples of how technology is ravaging our oceans. Satellites, tracking systems, radar systems, to essentially plunder the oceans. The same technology that could essentially protect the ocean is used to plunder it, because our economic model doesn't essentially price in protection. Destruction of biology has unleashed the pandemic. That's fundamentally it. The destruction of biology, the inability of human beings to understand limits in pursuit of essentially a sort of false narrative about how can we create prosperity. And we will have to rethink what that means. And there's more to come. And most critical basic needs for humanity are biological, not digital. Water and sanitation, resource use, food systems, self-sufficiency, etc. These are not digital in construct. They are biological in construct. Nevertheless, I will hint at that. Of course, digital technology can help, but that is not the panacea. Understand the basics, biology, protect the biology, and human beings will be able to have a fairer, more just world in which we live. So prevention and mitigation of all of these things required us to essentially understand the biology of human beings. The vaccine is essentially the ability to essentially allow the biology of the human body to create a self-protecting mechanism against the invasion of the virus. It's biology at work. So we have at the Global Institute for Tomorrow come up with a term called IR 1.0, rather than the Industrial Revolution 4.0, which has been the mantra coming out of Davos, I think 4 or 5 years ago, and then it invaded the whole world like a virus. It went everywhere. I go to parts of the world where in World Economic Forum conferences, where elites gather, they all start talking about 4.0. And I remind them that 2 hours away from their city capitals, I can show you essentially industrial, large-scale, pre-industrial behaviors. And so this fantasy idea that we can have 4.0 needs to be deconstructed, and we call it IR 1.0, and IR standing for Insured Resilience. So what do I mean by insured resilience? Rather than relying on technology as a cure-all, ensure that civilizations have resilience to sustain prosperity for all. Most importantly, ensure basic needs are met. Food, healthcare, housing. Food is going to become much tougher. Healthcare, as we have seen, needs to be based on self-sufficiency. Housing around the world is going to be one of the biggest challenges around the world if we are to protect people. Supporting local industries and consumption, self-sufficiency is a pillar of national economic policy. My country, in which the average person probably eats 2 meals of rice, in neighboring Philippines, they ate 3 meals of rice. All of these countries are not self-sufficient in food. They don't grow their own rice. Yet we have blessed with water, sunshine, 360 days, 365, and we have essentially bought into some globalized fantasy with IR 4.0 and thought that we would have an app and it would deliver our food. Well, we're going to have to grow our food. And we've told all our kids they could all become software engineers and not farmers. So I argue with a tongue in cheek that the future knowledge worker is not a software geek, but essentially a farmer, knowledgeable, understands natural systems. And then we need to price their services properly as well. A diversified economy to support employment and gainful work, social protections built in, reducing reliance on fossil fuels. But we will need fossil fuels, particularly for many of the poorer parts of the world. And there is a narrative out of the West that somehow that we can have a zero carbon future. All of this is actually science fiction. There is no zero carbon world. There is a carbon world. The question is, how do we essentially mitigate against its excessive use and against the adverse impacts and on poorer populations? More effective global governance and managing global welfare, and importantly, managing the commons. How much time I have? 5 minutes. I got 5 minutes more. So I've introduced what I call the IR 1.0, which is insured resilience. And we direct all our efforts towards insured resilience. And therein, we can bring in the IR 4.0, tricks of big data and all of that stuff we can. But the fundamental pillar of policy making should be IR 1.0. IR 4.0 is essentially just an enabler for whatever vision IR 1.0 sets out in the world that we live in, given what I've shared with you. So an opportunity now to build a better and more resilient world. I don't want to go into the details, but just to remind everybody that when we talk about capital, there are 4 types of capital: natural, social, human, and economic. Our entire economic model is a collective free ride on natural capital, a free ride. The true problem at the heart of today's capitalism. The stock of natural assets, including water and flora, is the basis of our whole society and economy. The economic capital is the least important. It has no intrinsic value. It's just a mechanism for trading. But the economic model at the moment is a free ride and actually simply values economic capital, which has actually no intrinsic value. So the well-functioning society has 4 pillars, in my view, and for me, it starts with the government, policy making. And policy making is going to be so critical, and how policymakers begin to explain the world we live in, therefore they can introduce the policies, is a belief that I share very strongly, and I'm very keen to get people to understand that. And I've seen too many policymakers subcontract or abdicate responsibility and outsource it to tech companies, believing the Ubers of the world are somehow going to solve their problems, or Google. And then there's business, there's civil society, and of course, media. I'll finish off by just saying, my friends, that I believe that policy making in the 21st century is going to be so important. I've coined a phrase called the sustainable state. The state has 3 principal responsibilities: protecting common and public goods, be it the air, water systems, or be it essentially the social obligations that people have to each other, providing access to the basic rights of life, and defining a path to what I call a moderate prosperity. Not this idea that everyone can be rich and live the American dream, which is a fantasy, and it's not even happened in America, and is now being essentially dismantled in front of our very own eyes, and allowing societies to prosper within hard resource constraints. So setting a path for a hot, crowded, and constrained future is the obligation of the state through sound policies. And therein, I believe, in, especially in this part of the world, I talk about the need for law and order, physical infrastructure, basic housing, sustainable food production, which is a complex socio-economic transformation in our societies, water and sanitation. And the irony that during the pandemic, we've all been told to wash our hands, clean, etc. Yet you will all know that 80% of the world doesn't have access to proper water and sanitation. And we will need to invest billions of dollars over the next 20 years to essentially allow those people to have that. This healthcare, energy, education, vocational training, and financial inclusion. I'm not going to into all of these details, but the common narratives of technology today are so far-fetched. This is not the world we live in, that somehow there will be digital connectivity and everything will be okay. Well, the world I live in is one in which digital connectivity has not improved the lives of people in terms of their basic health. It has improved it for some elites. It has not provided toilets. It has not improved the natural systems, and it has not stopped the destruction of the natural world. So bigger, faster, cheaper, and more convenient, but should that be our focus? More delivery of food through drones and making everything cheaper so that you can watch movies on streaming. I don't think this is the future. So I think our world has many other things to really deal with, which affect the majority of people: resource constraints, climate, waste, lack of education, unserved populations, and water crisis. These are not issues that are supposed to be the responsibility of NGOs and fringe activities. My belief is that this is the absolute responsibility of policymakers around the world to deal with, and not see that as detached from the idea of economic development. And technology can be an enabler. I'm told my time is up, so I'll just leave it there. I've got a few more slides, but I think my message is very clear. I want to just remind people that what we require is a major rethink in the way we imagine the future. I've got too much here to go through, but I will end by saying that in 2050, the likely scenario is the world will have a population of 10 billion. Seawater rise will be 1.5 to 2.2 meters. 300 million people or more will face annual floodings, and the increase in urban temperatures can be 2 to 5 degrees C. And there's major extinction of flora and fauna around the world. What kind of future do we want? I think we need a pathway to safe and secure a future in which the things that I mentioned become critical to the way policymakers think. And then finally, the moderate prosperity. Not everyone can be rich, nor should we aspire to create a world in which richness is essentially achieved through a complete disregard for how we create material wealth and how we manage the interface with the resource constraints of our time. What needs to be done? Reset our economies, reset what growth is meant to achieve, reset how society should be governed and to what end, reset the role of technology, and reset what we mean by freedoms, rights, and prosperity. Let me end there. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thought-provoking indeed, my friend Chandran Nair. Excellent job in dissecting such a subject matter in a rational and balanced way. Really appreciate your time and the effort to discuss the subject matter. Now we'll be moving to the question section of this session. So we'll take the first question. How can we manage ensured resilience in countries with political instability?
Well, we need to clearly understand what is the source of political instability. Much of the political instability in different countries are a function of both geopolitical tensions and in those instances, geopolitical tensions require big powers to essentially come to another way of looking at things. But where you have political instability, but you still have the basic infrastructure of the state to create policies, then I think policies can reduce the political instability as well. So I would distinguish between political instability that is a function of geopolitics and political instability that is a result of mismanagement of internal affairs. So in my country, we are not influenced at the moment by geopolitics, but we do have political instability. And that in political instability in our country, in Malaysia, is not war, but it's essentially, what can I say, an inability to bring about the type of economic growth and prosperity that people need, and which is fair. And that political instability is a result of mismanagement and bad policies. So one of the things that people like me, like citizens like me, try and do is try and get good policy making ideas and reimagining the future to policy makers. But there's this is a bigger discussion, which you all know. But if you have policy making institutions where you do not essentially have competence, where for whatever reasons political influence has eroded the competence of policy making, then you have a real problem. And I was so pleased when I talked to you all for a few minutes to understand, I was so impressed that you were reaching out to the world, looking for different ideas, and that you were even fair enough to allow a maverick like me to come and speak to you. So, but you know I'm right, yeah. But what I'm saying though is, you have to have those institutions, whatever the circumstances. In a situation like some of the countries in the Middle East, geopolitics is essentially eroded the very institutions. It's going to be very hard. But in other situations where bad management, incompetence, then those of us who are citizens, I always talk about this, we should not believe that policymakers do not need advice from those of us who are citizens who have ideas and partake in it, not as dissidents and as critics, but as partners with policymakers. Go and give good ideas. That's a shorter sort of answer to your question.
Excellent. So next question, you mentioned the importance of policymaking becoming an integrated skill that probably everyone should have. Although I'm a doctor in behavioral genetics based in Kuwait University, I've recently completed a 10-week course in LSC policymaking. I realized everything that was paralyzing my progress and productivity was policy related rather than behavior genetics capability, which led me to taking this policymaking course. My question is therefore, how can we get leaders and decision makers to acquire such policymaking skills for them to understand and facilitate the policies related to productivity and the changes you have mentioned in your talk today?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and essentially policy making and the capabilities of basically producing people who want to partake in policy making and creating the institutions is a societal mission. It cannot be just created ad hoc. It's a long-term process, and it's so nice to see that you're building this policy Public Policy Center, etc. And it needs a long-term commitment. And at the same time, it needs leadership. Let's be very clear. In the absence of leadership, you don't get a lot done. You have to have people with vision who are willing to invest and build the infrastructure. I can give a couple of examples from this part of the world. There is Singapore, where policy making is the center of everything the government thinks about. It essentially has a public policy school where it brings international speakers, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It essentially taps the best minds to become policymakers. It pays policymakers very well, and it's prestigious to be a policymaker. At the same time, I have had a lot of experience, not a lot, enough experience working in different parts of China. In China, policymaking is distributed right across the country, and there are hundreds of institutions where policymaking is essentially seen as a major exercise and a profession in which the best and brightest excel. So you have to create those kinds of culture, the institutions, and you have to make it a respectable sort of role that people can play. And then you have to have institutes of education where people study policy. I'm always a bit aghast, and I'm not trying to be critical of the person who asked the question, but people go and study policy in the United States. And therefore come back with ideas that are completely unsuited to their own circumstances. This is so important to understand. So foreign policy, you go and learn that in the United States. That's a bit of an oxymoron. Foreign policy needs to be something that we in this region need to build and understand, whether it's the South China Sea issues or whether it's in the Middle East. So we have to build that, and we have to get people in for the most senior people, the leaders of countries, to invest in policy making and in institutions that nurture the talent to go and study policy.
Excellent.
And write our own books, by the way, write our own books, not the ones just at LSE or from Harvard or John Hopkins.
Good point. Next question. Is there an end point to capitalism? Can late stage capitalism and neoliberalism practically be reformed?
It's a good question. I like to try and think of, I do a whole session about what I call the reshaping of capitalism. Capitalism is simply, I call it just a terminology word, and then it became ideological. And then it became ideological. If you're not a capitalist, you're a bad person, then you must be the socialist. And the most dumb version of that conversation takes place in the United States. You're a capitalist, otherwise you're a socialist or you're a communist, right? But fundamentally, what are we trying to do? We are trying to organize our economies. Isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to organize our economies. And then we look at why are we trying to organize our economies? Hopefully, we're trying to organize our economies because we want to create fairer societies. That's why we do it. If you're a policymaker, you want to create a fairer society, not because you're a do-gooder maybe, but because it's actually in your interest. If you create fairer societies, then you have a stable society in which, whether you're in a democracy or a non-democracy or a monarchy, you essentially have a stable society, and that is essentially in your own interest as well. So whichever system you are in, you're essentially trying to create stable societies which are fairer and in which people believe in and invest in, your citizens. And then you say, okay, what is the pathway to that? What is the pathway? And the pathway to that, therefore, is called organizing the economy. Whether you call it the capitalist model or whatever model, that will depend on what the results look like. And I think there was a famous saying by Lee Kuan Yew, I don't care what you call it. But what we need to do is to essentially harness the talent of the people, the resources at our disposal, to essentially create a society that thrives. Then you can question, what do we mean by thrive as well? And that, I think, is a good question to ask at this point. So when I'm asked at times by governments, or I say, well, at this point, what do you want your country to look like in 30 years? Do you want all your people sitting at home watching Netflix and streaming and having pizzas delivered to them by a drone? And if that's your idea of modernization, well, that would be very sad. Then, but on the other hand, if you're looking for a society in which you create limits on essentially what the natural capital should be, what do you want your society to be educated in, what value systems they want, etc., and you understand all the threats, you want all your rivers to be cleaner, then you have to go to do something differently. If you want your forests to be protected, then you have to do things differently. And then if you think that your economic activity is dominated by rent-seeking essentially actors, you have to do certain things. But fundamentally, what do you want it to look like? If you want it to look like one in which people are all eating imported food, then you have a very different trajectory. So my thing is there's no end point again. What is the end point clearly will be, are we going to essentially squander all our natural capital in ways that we are already very fast tracking on and create a world in which there are huge disparities? Or are we going to be much smarter, look at the scientific evidence, and essentially create a pathway towards a world in which people have equal access to resources? Which way you do it, you can call it whatever you want, but let's not get bogged down in ideology.
Next question. And as much as I do agree, the existing system is man-made. 2, how to harness the same human behavior to redirect?
How to harness?
How to harness the same human behavior to redirect it?
Yeah, I think the way to harness it is to essentially make people clear about the time we live in. It comes back to my previous point. I think most people can subscribe to a logical description of where we are going, and particularly if it then says in our country we have X million people. These are our major constraints at the moment. We are therefore going to make policies that will require citizens to participate in the next 20 years in these things. The trade-off is going to be this, 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 and this. But the upside is going to be a fairer society for these reasons and an improved quality of life. But what we have done, and particularly in the developing world, I talked about the post-colonization era. We all basically said, we don't have any of our books. Let's follow all the books written by the Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and MIT, and let's see what they did. Well, what they did was essentially an extractive, exploitative, exceptional way of development, right? Because they were essentially ruling the world. They had an economic model. I call it the East India Company model, which was extractive. That model doesn't work for us, but we sent all our elites to buy into that. And now is the time for us to think again. And so to think again, our policymakers have to be grounded in the realities of our world, rather than in the virtual world of Silicon Valley and all of that hubris. Our world is very different. And therefore, being grounded in that, then you start saying, people, this is what we have. This is what the science tells us. This is where we're going. This is what our culture needs to do. This is the knowledge we have. This is what we want to preserve. And this is how we're going to do it. Can you buy into it? That, I think, is vision, policy making, using the know-how and technology. I am not suggesting we turn the lights and go backwards, not at all. But we need to be grounded in our realities. And that's, I think, what we need to do in terms of bringing people along. But too many people, too many political leaders and business leaders in the developing world post-colonization had no idea what they wanted to do apart from follow a Western economic model, which was premised on essentially consumption, externalizing costs, exceptionalism, and no limits. So the Western model, and I'm not trying to suggest I'm anti-Western at all, please. A non-Western way of thinking is not the same as being anti-Western. But a non-Western way of thinking is to suggest that there are limits to what we can do. Our populations are much larger. And that we must need to understand the historical context within which the Western economic model was built. It was built on essentially dominance, hegemony, extraction, and exploitation. And now, because that direct exploitation was not possible, it is now replaced by essentially, hey, we cannot restrict growth. Our people are free. Therefore, we will have solutions. There can be no restraint. And the solution is always technology. And some of that be freedom, capitalism, and democracy. Well, that is too simplistic. That is too simplistic. And so when you start to restrict, then you start talking about a very difficult issue, which is, so what are your freedoms? Which, when you start talking about freedoms in the Western world, that's anathema. You can't talk about it, right? But I know in Asia, we can't all own cars. We need more cars in Asian cities like I need a hole in my head, right? But try telling that in the United States or in Europe, because it's seen as an infringement on liberties. But we do not have unfettered freedoms. So we're going to have to use economic models to price it, price what rights we have and what privileges we have.
Excellent. Leading to the next question beautifully. It seems like there's an imbalance between how the majority of the world are actually living and how the rich and elite picture the world. How would a rebalance of these two separate realities happen? And how would a rebalance between these two look like?
Well, a rebalance, I mean, it's not half actually, it's 1/4 and 3/4, really. It's not half and half, right? You know, people like me, we're the freak shows. I'm the privileged lot. But the majority of the world doesn't have the access. So the only way it's going to happen is that, as I said right at the start, we have to change the narrative. And that is incumbent on people like you, me, changing that narrative. Because the dominant narrative is in denial of the facts and of the science. The dominant narrative is everyone can have everything. It is not possible. So talk to the scientists rather than the economists. Because that's kind of like the economists, we need them, but there's kind of a bit of mumbo jumbo there going on. But talk to the scientists. And the scientists will tell you, we can't all be eating fish every day. No way, right? If Chinese ate fish every day, which they have a right to, by the way, the oceans will be empty. And then all the Europeans will be complaining, but they be eating per capita more fish than the Chinese. So wait till the Indians come along, and then the Africans. So the reality is the change of the narrative. And the narrative is the ideological struggle of our times. And that narrative is essentially also a governance narrative. And one of the things that the tensions between the US and China and the West is the inabilities of the West to understand that a large nation like China with 1.3 billion people has managed to essentially rise itself out of poverty, not using the prescriptions of the West, which is everyone is free, there should be democracy, and there is no innovation with the democracy. So the Chinese are being incredibly innovative, and they are going to bypass the United States and the West, both in digital technology and in biosciences, etc. But they have one instrument, and they have a state and policy making to say, what can we have? So this notion of moderate prosperity is actually a Chinese notion, that we can't have everything. And so therefore we're going to constrain. So you have to essentially have policy making narratives to bring that change. But at a global level, the question is very relevant. I think it's an ideological fight. And we will see who wins that, but hopefully with not too many people who are, innocent sort of casualties in that. But that's essentially the tension we are fighting at the moment, that rebalancing. Those who control the financial market, those who control the technology, do not want that to be shared more equally. And thus you have Google is good, Huawei is bad, right? And that's the power struggle. I just argue that developing countries must be grounded in the realities of their own countries, not be seduced by the Silicon Valley and all of that nonsense. You take the best of technology, but be grounded in what do you want your country to look like in 30 years? Last question, sorry.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So last question before we take closing remarks from His Excellency. So you highlighted Nigeria as one of the important countries. Can you talk a bit more about it and its importance with regards to your thought-provoking lecture?
Well, I think Africa is, because I'm from Asia, I talk about a bit of the Asian perspective, but I did live in Africa for about 4 or 5 years. So it's close to my heart. And so is, the Middle East, which I've been to many times. I love the culture and all of that stuff. It's just, it enriches my soul, right? So, but Africa is going to be so important. Africa's population is now about 1.5 billion, I think, but it'll come to about 2 billion, right? But Africa's population in the space of 60 years is also quadrupled, right? Now, but Africa is lucky because it still has a lot of arable land and all of those things. But Nigeria is important because it has the largest population in Africa. It has tons of natural resources. So does the Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. So what I mentioned is, well, what will the large countries do? I mean, of course, we like places like Fiji and New Zealand, or Sweden, but kind of who cares? I'm not being disrespectful. There are like 5 or 6 people live there. It's not that important. But you have to be serious about big countries. Nigeria will have 250 million people. Indonesia will have 400 million people. India will have 1.5, China 1.3. These are Brazil, these are significant. But I mentioned Nigeria because it'll be the biggest population in Africa. How Nigeria manages will be so critical in terms of a model for the rest of Africa, a continent that has, in my view, an opportunity to do something different if they don't follow the path many Asian countries took, which was to ape the West. I think Africa has a chance. China is the only country in Asia that didn't fully ape it, but many countries in Asia are halfway through. And I go around saying, let's rethink. And I think at this moment in time, many Asian governments are thinking. But, I'm not in the majority, as you know, but I like to think that people are also listening. And that's why I mentioned Nigeria, a very important country, so much resources, many intelligent people, very diverse. If they can manage to show what can be done, then I think we have a very different future for the African continent. And in fact, it'll have ripple effects in the Middle East. And of course, there's Egypt, there's Iran, all these big countries coming together. They're going to matter.
Chandran, Nair, thank you so much. Now we'll take closing remarks from His Excellency Dr. Khalid Mehdi before we wrap up. The floor is yours, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nair, for the provocative as well as an interesting perspective at the global level. Usually, most of our speakers, they shed the light on national or perhaps best practices, but you took us today to a much higher level and thinking of the global arena. I really enjoy your lecture by giving a contrarian outlook on what many people think is the way to go. WEF, the World Economic Forum, actually, when they sent the fire on the Industrial Revolution version 4, they came up with a very interesting concept, is the digital economy, digitalization, blah, 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 all of these very nice jargon. And actually, it's addressing only for the owner of the East Indian Company. I like your expression on the on that East Indian, so I will use it copyrighted for you. So it was very interesting analogy, and I do believe this is part of what many people call transformation to more capitalism, but at the same time, it is always limitation. And the second law of thermodynamics is a clear law of physics that prove that the efficiency will never reach 100%, and whatever you are taking will be definitely cannot be coming back again. Yes, energy is conserved, but entropy is always going on the direction of increase. Well, we do believe that in Kuwait Public Policy Center, what we are trying is to invest on public policy making. I understand what Dr. Ahmed Assari's question by the need for more and more public policy makers, which is a very essential, and public policy understanding in the government and the public sector. This is the reason why we established Kuwait Public Policy in 2017, is to shed awareness and to improve the culture of policy making. Thank you very much, my dear. I don't want to take longer. It was a very interesting. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see that there's a very elite crowd that stayed today to listen to your lecture. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. The only disappointment I have is that I couldn't actually come to Kuwait. So I hope once travel is permitted, I will be able to come and engage in a share some discussion on policy making. And it's been a great honor and privilege for me to do this. I hope I added a bit of value. Thank you.
We will be definitely looking forward to meet you here. Faris, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chandran. Thank you for your time. Thank you for generous information sharing. And we hope to see you real soon in Kuwait, inshallah. Thank you again. And thank you to our audience and guests for tonight.
Inshallah. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you.